So the last time we talked, we were looking at the different Bible translations and how they came to be. We looked at we've been looking at the differences between the Protestant and the Catholic Bibles. Obviously, the Catholic Bibles, including the intertestamental books or the Apocrypha. And we talked about how that came to be versus the Protestant Bible and why the Protestant Bible does not use the intertestamental or apocryphal books. So once we got into that, we then started looking into where the translations come from. And the Catholic Bible was translated from the Septuagint, which was the Greek the first Bible that was transcribed from Hebrew into Greek, and that was done for one of the Ptolemies, or one of the at the time would have been Egyptian pharaohs that were called Ptolemies during the Roman period. So that is where the Septuagint came from, and that is the translation that the Catholic Bible came from, and later the Catholic Bible was transcribed into Latin. And that became a staple for many, many, many years. And the Catholic Church ended up banning any other book that was written in any other language. And there's a lot of political issue with that. So we ended up getting into the idea that the Protestant Bible was actually translated from a different set of books. So the Catholic Bible was translated from the Septuagint. However, the Protestant Bible was translated from the Masoretic text, which is a little different, in the idea of who or the people or the groups of people that actually translated the Masoretic text. So the Septuagint literally means the 70, and that was 70 Jewish scribes which translated that. But the Masoretic text was translated by a group of people known as the Masoretes. Okay, now the easiest way to explain who the Masoretes are. The Masoretes were considered to be schools of people. So you had about 3 different main schools. So it's like having a specific vocation. During that time, whatever it was that you did, you went and you spent time around the people that did that thing. So you would learn from the best possible sources on how to do it. And that's who the Masoretes were. They were different schools of pretty much people that transcribed the Bible. That is what they taught. That is what they did for a living. That is how they existed. They went to these schools and they learned how to transcribe the Bible. And so what you have is, let's say, we can look at it like a car. Let's look at the Bible like a car for a second. You have the engineer who actually designs the car. In this particular case, the engineer of the Bible would be God. And then you have the mechanic who you actually take the car to when it breaks down. So the Bible itself was lost, it was destroyed, it was burned, or I say the scrolls, the original scrolls from the Bible were lost or burned and destroyed. So you go to the engineer. When your car breaks down, you go to the you go to the mechanic, so the mechanic can fix the car. So the Masoretes were kind of like the mechanics because they knew all about the car. They're the ones that they studied it, they protected it, they wrote it over and over again for years. So they had a wealth of knowledge about the Bible and what was in it. So therefore, when it came time for the Bible to have to be reproduced, they were a very, very reliable source on what was supposed to be in it and what wasn't. Now, with that being said, the whole reason, and it's very ironic, but the whole reason that the Masoretes decided to put the Bible back together again in terms of the Old Testament, they put the Old Testament back together again and made it official. And they did it in a way that was pretty much revolutionary in terms of what the Bible had seen up to that point, or the copies of the Bible that had been made up to that point. But the whole reason they did it was because they were refuting Christianity. So you had this up and coming religion of Christianity, and they were saying we need to go back to what the Old Testament says. So we are going to reproduce a Bible that is that is as close as we can possibly get to the original. And so they put a system together to help do that. Now, that was done somewhere between 500 and 1000 AD. It was started somewhere around 500 AD, and it was finished somewhere around 1000 AD. Now, it is important to understand that the Old Testament canon was already established by then. We knew what they knew what the Old Testament canon was, but they went ahead and made it official in somewhere around 500 AD, so that everybody could have a standardized version of what the Bible of the Old Testament was supposed to be. They wanted absolutely no question about that. So they standardized the Old Testament Bible. Now, with that being said, there were various ways that they did it, but I don't want to skip this part first. When we look at our Bibles today, we get our Bibles, the King James, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the New International Version. All of these Bibles are translated from the Masoretic text. So the Bibles that we read today, King James, English Standard, New American Standard, New International Version. These came from the Masoretic text. That's what they were transcribed from. And even after 1943, some of the Catholic Bibles were translated from the Masoretic text as well. They changed from the Septuagint to the Masoretic text. And those Bibles were the New American Bible, the New Jerusalem Bible. And the rest were still being translated from the Septuagint. So the word Masorah itself, that is pretty much the root of Masoretic. So it's the Masorah, but it means to bind or to hand down. And so what people are referring to, that's what the word means, but what people are referring to when it comes to Masorah is the technique that was used by the Masoretes in order to reproduce the Bible. All right, so there are 3, maybe 4 basic components of it. And the first component is to provide critical notations about the received text. So in other words, they added letters, they added vowel sounds, they had accents, and they also added marginal notes. That's very important, because without those things, we would kind of be lost today in terms of understanding the Bible itself. So when I say they added letters, they added literal letters. So the original writings did not come with vowels. The original writings came with consonants. So what the scribes or the Masoretes had to do was actually standardize a way of speaking or a way of translation. So you have to remember, the original texts were coming out of Hebrew. And so there is a language barrier there because you're trying to go from Hebrew to Greek. Now, when this was done, because you had different Bibles that were actually produced, there was more than just the Masoretic text. Like I said, you had the Septuagint, you had the Syriac, and there were maybe 3 or 4 other Bibles that were out there. But what was happening is you had these different texts that were using different letters, different enunciations, because when they were being transcribed, they were being transcribed for a people group, and it was nothing that was standard. So let's say if I lived in Russia, well, I would transcribe the Bible in my native tongue, which would be Russian. But if I lived in Ethiopia, well, I would transcribe it in my native tongue, which would be in Ethiopic. So what was happening is you had these different Bibles that were being translated, and many of them were being translated into Greek. But during that time, you also had various different versions of Greek that were being spoken because of the dialect of the region. So it's like in Louisiana, you have people that speak English, you have people that speak French, you have people that speak Cajun, which is a mixture of the two. So when you think about which particular spot in Louisiana you're from, that is going to determine which language you speak or what you understand or how you pronounce or enunciate things. That's like saying Coochieville. Well, if you look at it and you're from North America somewhere, then or I'll say upstate somewhere, then you're going to look at it and say Cloutierville. It's not going to be Cloutierville, it's going to be Cloutierville. So depending on where you're from determines how you enunciate or how you say specific things. So one of the things that the Masoretes did was they developed different symbols and signs that help us to better understand how words were originally pronounced. And what that does is it gives us a more of a or it gives us a closer representation of what was intended by the writers when they read and how they were intending for things to be sounded out from an oratorical perspective. So they gave us punctuations, they gave us cantillation marks. And what this did for us, so let's say the name of Moses's mother, Jochebed. Well, in America, we may say Jochebed, but over in the original, which would have been in Africa, in Egypt, it would have been pronounced Ibed. So it's something completely different. And that is what the Masoretes did. They put the cantillation marks there. They put the different punctuations there so we could have a better understanding. If you know how to read the cantillation marks, if you know and understood their punctuations, then you would be able to not only say and pronounce, but you would be able to read the writings in the way that it was originally written. So it would be the closest possible thing to being a part of the original writings that we could possibly have. And so that's what the Masoretes' work was all about. It was about the reproduction. It was about trying to get as close to the original writings as they could possibly get. And it was also about trying to make sure that those that came behind them that were transcribing the Bible could preserve the best possible translation and techniques. So the Masoretes did a pretty big work. They really did. It was very in depth. Now, with some of the works that they did, they also, with the cantillation marks, they also introduced the people or those that could read them to the idea of how things were read. So depending upon which books you read, there was a certain way that it would have been read in the synagogue. So when you look at books like Proverbs, Psalms, probably Songs of Solomon, books like these would have been read in a particular way because they were written as songs. So there would be inflections on certain parts of the readings. There would be a rhythm that the books were being read with. And so if you understood these cantillation marks and these punctuations, then you would have been able to read the Old Testament the same way that the original Hebrew people did. And that is why the Masoretic text is held in such a high regard, because there was a whole lot of attention to detail in the way it was produced. Also, Job was another one of those books that was written in a way that it was supposed to be sang and not just read. And even in the synagogues, they practiced these particular readings and they practiced this style of oratorical delivery. And that was a part of the rituals for the Sabbath. They also added what they called conjunctive and disjunctive symbols, which will be like periods and commas. And that helped those that were coming behind them and transcribing the Bible or copying the Bible, that helped them to understand when a thought was being finished and another thought was being expressed, or when a thought was still conjoined, or was there was just a brief pause, like a comma. You read a sentence, then there's a brief pause, but the sentence that follows is still a part of the first thought. So that helped in the understanding of how things were supposed to be read, which also helped in the idea of the Bible being transcribed. So when we look at what they did there, that was very helpful, but they also added notes, or what we would call today cliff notes. So after, or in the side margins, after they had finished writing, what they would do is they would add little notes into the margins that help people to understand about what was going on, or the message that was trying to be conveyed, or how something was supposed to be written or read. So they added extra notes in along with the cantillation marks and the punctuations to actually help assist with the understanding of what was going on there. Now, they also added what they called the Masora Magna, which was basically the first concordance. And what it did was it compared different words, or it compared similar words that were used in different places. So if, let's say you had the word, what's a good one? Yoke. If the word yoke was used in a particular place and it meant a particular thing, then they would also compare it to the word yoke in another place. and make sure that, or let you know if the word yoke in this place meant the same thing as the word yoke in that place. Or there are different words in the Bible. It may mean one thing or be used in one way in one spot, but that same word may be used differently in another spot. And that's something that we see commonly in the Bible. One word, when you translate it, it could have several different meanings. So it gives you the meaning of each word that was being used. And that was the Masoretic Magna. That was also very helpful in the translation. And that is why the Masoretic text, like I say, once again, is highly esteemed. There was the Masoretic Parva, which is notes in the outside margin, usually written in Aramaic, but sometimes written in Hebrew. So once again, helpful. And then there was what they call the Katib and the Keri. All right. So these are symbols. The Katib was a symbol of a symbol that was used traditionally is a symbol that marks the traditional way that a word was written, while the Keri was a symbol that marks what the Masoretes believed was the correct wording. Okay. So now, when I say the correct wording, why do I say that? Once again, that goes back to translation issues. So in the Greek, sometimes it can be a lot like Spanish, in the idea that in English, we would say, let's just for example, we would say the red apple, or let's go to the store. Well, in Spanish, you might say the store, let's go to. So in Greek, like I said, you have various different forms of Greek. So what the Masoretes did was, when they saw the translation may have been written backwards or written in a way that wasn't original to how the Hebrew people would have written it, then they transcribed it and they put that mark there to let you know that, hey, this is how it probably should have been written, but this is what was actually there. So they gave you that breakdown of exactly what was going on. This is how you should probably read this, but from the oldest text that we have, this is what's actually there. And they're letting you know that we think this was an error that came about in translation. Because you have to remember, this was done in 500 AD. So you have about where it was started in about 500 AD. So the temple was burned in 856 BC. You have different writings that showed up in different places. So you have almost 1,000 years that these people are trying to reconstruct from. So therefore, when they saw the writings that they had and they studied the Hebrew in its original form, they made certain conclusions. Okay, when it was transcribed this time, it was transcribed inaccurately, most likely. This is what it was supposed to say. But to be sure that we preserve what we have in respect, we're going to put it the way that we found it. But this is what is probably, this is what was probably meant by what it was saying. And so when we have this type of information, what we can do next is, when we find different texts, such as some of these other texts that I told you about earlier, the Syriac Bible, you have the Leningrad Codex, you have I can't think of the name of it, the Aleppo Codex. You have these different books or different Bibles that we find. And then when we look at these Bibles, we can look at them and say, hey, okay, these are the same. This one is different. The Masoretic text is telling me that this particular way that this scripture is written, this is how we found it, but this is probably what it should be. And then let's just say we find an older text that has it the way that it should be. Then we know that the Masoretic text was probably justified in the way that the Masoretes actually annotated everything. So it's just a proofing, so to speak. It's a proofing of what we find and the authenticity of the original text. All right. The next thing, and I found this to be kind of interesting, the writing style that was used. So I used to always wonder why, when I would pick up a Bible, especially an older Bible, instead of having the words written across the page, you would have these little skinny columns of words. Well, that is how the original scrolls would have been written. They would have been written in those little skinny columns of words on a piece of parchment. And that is called consonantal text. And what that is written by hand in a scroll. The text in such scroll is written in rather narrow columns. Each line typically contains 20 to 30 letters. The songs in the text, some of them would have been in Exodus or Deuteronomy, are spaced as poetry according to fixed conventions, which differ between those two chapters, actually. So you had several different ways of writing, so to speak. So you had the songs in Exodus and Deuteronomy. You have some different songs in Judges, and of course we talked about earlier in Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. So all of these, there were basically two different styles of annotating these types of songs. So the Masoretes actually included all of that type of information in there. And that was the continental text. Now, that brings us to the Aleppo Codex. So the majority of our Bibles today were translated from either the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex. These were two Bibles that were produced by the Masoretes. So the Aleppo Codex, this was Aleppo was a place in Israel, and this is the oldest Bible that we have. And this Bible was found in about 915, or written about 915 AD. Now, that particular Bible was actually burned. So it was, a lot of the information in it was lost. So what the majority of today's Bibles are based off of are the Leningrad Codex. Now, the Leningrad Codex was actually originally written in Cairo, Egypt. And some kind of way it ended up going over to Russia. And because it was in Russia, it's now known as the Leningrad Codex. It was the St. Petersburg Codex, and then some things happened in Russia, and St. Petersburg was known as Leningrad. And then the name changed again, but they kept the name Leningrad Codex. So the Leningrad Codex was written about 100 years after the Aleppo Codex, but the Leningrad Codex is still in complete intact. It's still intact today. It's complete and whole. It's actually in the museum. Now, the reason that the Leningrad Codex is so important is because of the simple fact that this is the work of the Masorete that was actually preserved, and helps us to have a better understanding of what the Bible is what it was, and as far as we can tell, what it should be. Now, a lot of information was confirmed that was in a lot of the information that was in the Leningrad Codex was confirmed by what they found in the Qumran caves. So the Qumran caves was a place on the Dead Sea, and they found a bunch of different jars in a cave, and these different jars were contained scrolls of the Bible. So the people of Qumran, they had somewhat of a Masoretic community, so to speak. And so what we found there were different scrolls, different versions of different scrolls. And what it did confirm, well, one of the things that it did confirm was that there were other translations of the Bible that were out there. It confirmed that not everybody used the Masoretic system, but there were places where the Masoretic text was identical to the scrolls that were found in Qumran. So that lets us know that the Bible itself is very, very healthy in terms of what we read, in terms of the understanding that is to be given through the Bible. So one of the things, and I'll just get into this really, really quickly, but one of the things that people say is that the Bible is faulty and it has a lot of errors in it, which that is, if you want to be technical about it, the Bible is not faulty. What God gave, his word is inspired. That's always true. But when we talk about translation, there are some things that were that have not been consistent in translation. When I say consistent, which I mean there are variants, just because different scribes wrote for people to understand the writings in their particular area. So like I said, it's the difference between saying, let's go to the store, or the store let's go to. So there are people that say that the Bible is completely full of errors and there are so many different versions of it. Yeah, there are many different versions of it, but in terms of error, that number would be very, very minuscule. So are there any questions, thoughts, or ideas? If not, we're just going to go ahead and close out in a prayer. Heavenly Father, we come to you right now, thanking you for this time and this opportunity. Once again, we just ask that the information that was put out on today would be used and be used in a healthy manner in order to help bring souls to you. We thank you and we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.